It's a pleasure to be here, and I will be, thank you, Nigel, for that extremely flattering introduction. And I'll be speaking to you, as I do in my book, from several decades of experience, with one foot in African villages and the other in UN meeting rooms, and the lessons that I've garnered about food systems and governance, in which a very key word is power. And food regimes analysis is a useful tool to understand how world capitalism has used its power to organize agricultures in order to enhance profits. There have been different phases in which different actors have played the central organizing role, starting with Great Britain in its imperialist phase from the 1870s through the 1930s, linking emerging industrial capitalism to cheap food supplies throughout the world. Then the US, after World War II, up through the 70s, with green revolution technology and food aid, handing over quite smoothly to the multinational corporations in the 80s. Now, food regimes emerge out of contests between these powerful political and economic actors and social movements, workers, farmers, whereby some kind of equilibrium is reached between profits and welfare. And they're legitimized by narratives that talk about all the benefits they're supposed to provide. The rules by which they operate seem natural until the equilibrium breaks down, when the internal contradictions turn into open conflict among key actors. And we are, I believe, in a period like that now. So the third food regime from the 1980s, led by agri-food corporations, legitimated by narratives about how it ensures food security, modernization, productivity, and backed by global policy. It's important to remember that corporations would never have built up the power they have without the complicity of governments, either in failing to regulate them or in actually pushing regulation that allows them to profit. Such that over the past 2 decades, there's been an astounding concentration of the power of transnational agri-food corporations, thanks to the rules that have been put in place. They're favored also by global market rules. Only about 15% of agricultural food products is traded on international markets. Yet the impacts of the way this market is organized and the volatility that it permits are visited on the local food systems of countries whose share in the global market is minimal, but have been obliged to open up to it by structural adjustment and trade agreements. So what we're looking at is a deep structural contrast between two very different approaches to food provisioning. And of course, rural social movements have been organizing progressively, particularly from the mid-80s on, in response to the negative impacts of global policies and corporate concentration on local livelihoods and territories. They reached up to the global level as it became increasingly clear that they needed to make their voices heard there, with the establishment of the WTO in 1995. And of course, as you know well, we're not speaking of an insignificant minority, but of some 3 billion family farmers, pastoralists, fisher folk, indigenous people, etc., producing most of the world's food. In the process, they've developed their own concept, food sovereignty, which turns upside down the logic of the corporate-led food supply system and the neoliberal policies on which it's based, by invoking the right of peoples to define their own healthy and sustainable food and agricultural systems based on a series of principles that I've summarized here. If you compare how the two approaches to food provisioning impact on the big challenges of today, there's no question as to which wins out in terms of conserving biodiversity, for example, protecting human health, and COVID reminds us of that, and fighting climate change. And when the conflict between these contrasting approaches mounted, a severe food price crisis erupted in 2007 and 2008, with food riots breaking out in cities across the world. So the international community was obliged to wake up and acknowledge the existence of a void in global governance. And thanks to an alliance between some G77 countries, Brazil and Argentina in particular, and the food sovereignty movement, the decision was taken to reform the existing UN Committee on World Food Security, or CFS. The reform was adopted in 2009 with very strong participation by peasant organizations and others. And these are some of the key aspects that they fought for and won. The CFS is based on a human rights framework. So people are rights holders and agents, and food is a human right, not a commodity. It is recognized as the central forum for policy coherence, fighting against the kind of fragmentation of food governance that we see. And civil society, social movements are full participants. They participate in the debate on the same footing as governments. Priority voice is accorded to constituencies of the food insecure. The private sector is in the room, but in a separate box without confusion. And decision-making is reserved for governments so they can be held accountable. And it's transparent because everyone is in the room. The strong participation of small-scale producers, indigenous peoples, and other social actors has made it possible to achieve some important results in the CFS over the past decade, like the first ever international agreement on the delicate issue of land tenure, which social movements are putting at the service of community struggles around the world, including in Europe. It's also proving possible in the CFS to challenge the terms of the debate on important points. It's been officially recognized in policy recommendations adopted by governments that it's the small-scale producers, not governments, not aid or corporations, who are responsible for most of the investment that takes place in agriculture. That's the big blue line on this graph. And also for producing most of the food we eat. So governments have been urged to promote markets that support small-scale producers' own efforts. But which markets are these? At the civil society insistence, this led to negotiations on this issue, which is at the very heart of the confrontation between the corporate supply system based on the logic of making a profit on invested capital, and that of socially embedded food systems, which remunerate producers for their effort and which reinvigorate local communities. The final adopted text recognizes that it's the multitude of diversified territorial markets in which practically all small-scale producers are involved, which are far more important than formal supply chains and value chains in terms of food security. In fact, 80% of the food consumed in the world never gets anywhere near a supermarket. It reaches consumers not through formal value chains, but through territorial markets rooted in local, national, and regional food systems. So with just these couple of examples, I hope I have convinced you that the CFS, the only global forum that gives voice to those most affected by the policies under discussion, does make a difference. But there are big challenges. Indeed, we are in a phase of breakdown of the current food regime, and capitalism, as it always does, is doing its best to turn the crisis to its advantage. We're witnessing the rise of a paradigm of trust in the corporate private sector as the stalwart leader of the fight against food insecurity, with public-private partnerships as the preferred instrument, and contract farming tying small-scale producers into the trap of corporate-led value chains, despite the fact that the evidence is to the contrary. As in the case of the Alliance for a Green Revolution for Africa, AGRA, launched in 2006 by the Gates Foundation and agri-food corporations like Yara, with the former UN Secretary General as figurehead. By 2020, AGRA had invested a total of $1 billion in 13 countries, while the governments concerned had devoted 1 billion per year to subsidizing farmers' purchases of green revolution inputs. Productivity and income have not increased, but food insecurity has. We're also witnessing ever more sweeping mergers, horizontal and vertical, with big data leading the way, and more audacious technological innovations, of which my favorite are the striped drones to pollinate plants sold by the same companies that killed off the bees with their pesticides. And moving into the world of formal governance, a project of what's fondly known as multi-stakeholderism, launched by the Global Club of Corporates, the World Economic Forum, that foresees switching from what they see as ineffective multilateral mode of governance to one in which the big global problems should be tackled by consortia of the willing and able, led by corporations and philanthrocapitalist foundations with all their dynamism and know-how, and incorporating a sprinkling of well-chosen governments, UN people, academics, NGOs. Everyone's welcomed into the room on the same footing, like foxes and chickens in the same coop, with no regard for power imbalances, differences of interest, roles and responsibilities, putting an end to human rights-based governance and accountability. In June 2019, the World Economic Forum signed a partnership agreement with the Office of the Secretary General of the UN, giving them unprecedented access to UN fora and programs. Successively, the Secretary General announced the convening of a food systems summit, to which Nigel referred, which will take place next September, co-organized by the World Economic Forum, aimed at grabbing global food governance from the inclusive multilateral CFS and handing it over to corporate-led work teams, which are busy promoting market-based solution to siloed problems rather than the holistic, radical transformation of food systems that's needed to put people and the planet over profits. However, there are cracks in the corporate armor. The corporate regime's performance is not matching the narrative that was supposed to legitimate it. And the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed and exacerbated the fragilities and the inequities of a corporate food system that's dependent on workers without rights who are declared to be indispensable, but are treated as though they were expendable, and the exploitation of nature beyond planetary limits. Everyone's speaking about the need to transform our food systems, but the recipes are very different. The World Economic Forum and the big exporting countries accent the need to ensure the smooth functioning of global supply chains and the global market, with a good dose of digitalization and high-tech food without farmers. And the voices of those most affected on the ground, evidence from social actors and communities in all regions has been brought together in this document on the screen, whose reading I recommend to all of you. It testifies to certainly the suffering that communities have experienced, but also to their solidarity and the innovation they've demonstrated, and describes the pillars of structural transformation that they're proposing, breaking away from a neoliberal policy orientation towards an economy based on solidarity and care, of which women, of course, bear the greatest burden. Human rights as the basis for COVID-19 responses. Putting food sovereignty into practice with support for agroecology, people's access to resources, territorial food systems, people's knowledge. Reaffirming the primacy of the public sphere over PPPs, and strengthening food governance with the inclusive Committee on World Food Security as the foremost global policy forum. So, This is the big challenge of global food governance today, resisting the World Economic Forum Food System Summit and a corporate takeover, defending the inclusive multilateral Committee on World Food Security, and building better food governance from below. And in conclusion, striving for convergence among the social movements and communities that are fighting the same battle for democracy and against corporate capture from different entry points: food, health, education, climate change, economic justice, feminism. In a word, from food sovereignty to people's sovereignty. Thank you.